Welcome everyone to an edition of Governed by God, a biblical look at law, civics, and civil government. My name is Eric Loophole. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. So, what I'm going to do today is continue with our series looking at the origin and history and founding of the United States, and to do so from a biblical perspective to provide some historical context. And of course, we want to give an honest look based on what Scripture has to say about these things. And so over the past several episodes, we looked at the origin of the colonies, the English Civil War. We looked at the breakdown of the relationship between English Parliament and the American colonies, as well as the failure of King George III to maintain his end of the covenant between the crown and the colonies. And so now I want to look at the Declaration of Independence itself, and I want to go through it, look at each of the grievances, and to see are these legitimate reasons for what they're doing. Just a quick background story. I remember in AP US History back in high school, we had a discussion and a debate on whether or not the United States should separate from England. And both sides went back and forth, but ultimately the majority of the students voted to stay with England, and they thought that the United States did not have good reason, and really they were just complaining about having to pay taxes. And I think that just goes to show how much of a disservice the public school system has done to our own citizens, to the point that they would actually have voted to be and remain British subjects. And so we're going to go through the Declaration of Independence, and I'm going to play a recorded version that was read by Michael Scherer, and then we will respond to it. But before I do that, I want to first remind you that Future of Christendom is hosting its second annual Lancastrian Theonomy Symposium on March 14th, 2026 in Ephrata, Pennsylvania. So it's going to be just a one-day event. I myself will be there and will be speaking on the topic of just war theory based on Deuteronomy chapter 20. Other speakers will be Luke Saint, Conrad Martin, John Bingaman, Joel Saint, and others. And then they're also going to do some mock cases where they look at situations and they try to resolve them in a just manner. And really the goal with this symposium is to show the beauty and importance and usefulness of God's law as opposed to man-made law. So go to futureofchristendom.org/events and you can get tickets to the symposium. They're only $5, and I hope to see you there. So let's begin with the Declaration of Independence.
The Declaration of Independence. A declaration by the representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled July 4, 1776. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume, among the powers of the earth, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
Okay, so we'll stop there first. That's the introduction, essentially. And so the idea here is it ever okay for a group of people to separate themselves from a larger group or a group that they already were part of in an official political capacity? Now, I think the answer is yes, and I think a good analogy to it is the issue of divorce. So if someone were to say there is never, ever, according to Scripture, any justification for separating yourself from another civil body, as a group of people, whether it's a county or a city or a state or a tribe, it's never okay to separate yourself from whatever group you're a part of. Well, that would be hard to justify given the existence of divorce. If divorce is a real thing that can happen, and God allows to happen because of the sinful nature of mankind, then how could we say that a divorce on a grand scale, kind of a collective divorce of one group of people from another, that's not possible? God would never allow for that. And those people who are suffering must always and forever continue to suffer and can never separate. Well, that'd be ridiculous. And interestingly, you actually see a couple situations in Scripture where God does not condemn what was happening. Well, first of all, you have the people of Israel leaving Egypt after 400 years of being slaves. Okay, so there's that. You also have, after Solomon dies and Rehoboam takes over, he has an opportunity to maintain a unified Israel and Judah. But he follows his young counselors and threaten to impose heavier labor upon the people of Israel, the 10 northern tribes. And so as a result, they separate. He tries to force them back in, but that is not the case. Now, one might say, well, that was just a description of what happened. God never endorsed that. Well, but when Jeroboam, even before Rehoboam made his very poor decision, God sent a prophet to Jeroboam who was going to take over the 10 northern tribes, and even tells him in 1 Kings 11, if you will listen to all that I command you and will walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, I will be with you and will build you a sure house as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. So you see, is that the principle is, again, the throne is established by righteousness. And God was going to endorse Jeroboam if Jeroboam would follow the Lord. And so you see here a situation where a divorce, in a sense, takes place, a civil separation between Israel and Judah, and that is not just allowed by God, but in a sense, it's even possibly endorsed by God, because the Lord was going to get behind Jeroboam if Jeroboam was going to be a godly king. And the last thing I'll say about this Declaration of Independence is that it references the laws of nature and nature's God. So we have a union here of natural law and God's law. Basically, the laws of nature, quote unquote, are the same laws from God. It's the same God. It's the same moral code. So this is not like a secular way of getting around the fact that God is in charge. No, this is a common way in which it would have been expressed. So let's continue.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
Okay, happiness there is not a reference to just personal feelings of niceness, good feelings. It is a reference to a common understanding of happiness based on Aristotle and other philosophers. And this happiness is really more of a well-being, or a pursuit of the highest good, virtue, right? A good life, essentially. So there is a place for a national divorce, a breaking of the covenant. And this is a situation in which that would occur, where man's rights, human rights, are being trampled upon. Now, these rights are self-evident, and this is where I would actually probably not necessarily use that language, or I would clarify something. They are self-evident because it's part of general revelation, right? It's a Romans 2 kind of thing, where Gentiles who not have the law do by nature the things of the law, even though they haven't been given the law, because they're made in God's image and they live in God's world. So yes, there's a sense in which human rights, the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, property, all these things, there's a sense in which everyone knows that they exist, and people get upset when their life, liberty, pursuit of happiness is affected or restrained or threatened, right? But these things are self-evident because we are made in God's image and we live in his world. And so this is all part of God's law and the law of nature in the sense that in God's law as revealed in nature. Now, when they talk about revolting or breaking the bonds or throwing off the yoke of tyrants, they're not talking about the idea of assassinating the king and putting someone else in his place. So that's one of the reasons why the American quote unquote revolution, I don't like that word revolution. It is more of a divorce or separation, is different than the French Revolution. So I'll use the analogy of divorce again. In the American Revolution, you have a person who gets divorced and separates, and they go their separate ways. Okay? In the French Revolution, you have a person who murders the other spouse and then finds a new spouse or just decides to live alone. That is a very different way of ending marriage. So one's a proper way and one's a wicked way. So there you have it. That's the simplest way I can compare the two quote-unquote revolutions. Let's continue.
Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government, and to provide new guards for their future security.
And again, here our founders are very wise. You can't just end things, break relationships, and create a national divorce for stupid reasons, light and transient reasons, right? And they know that mankind we're more than likely to just suffer rather than try to deal with the root cause. People would just rather not have to bother with changing things. It's just easier to put up with the difficulties and the problems. And so what they're referencing here is the long train of abuses and usurpations, which we will get to, pursuing invariably the same object, which is to reduce them to despotism. So what you have going on here is they're going to lay out the case as to how the king has broken covenant with the colonies and has been doing so. This has been happening for many, many years, and the ultimate result is despotism, basically the loss of the rights as Englishmen, okay? The rights that were promised to them, not just in nature, but also in earlier things throughout English history, like the Magna Carta, or the result of the Glorious Revolution and the reign of William and Mary. Let's continue.
Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government.
So see here, they're not trying to remove the king and kill him.
The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
All right, so we're going to begin. This is the laying out the case. I mean, this is a very official legal document. We are laying out the case here now.
He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them.
So we have here the laws, well, the common law of England, first of all, but also the agreement between the king and the colonies, where the colonies had the ability to pass their own laws and manage their own taxes. They had their own legislative bodies. And so by forbidding the governors of those colonies to deal with the problems unless they first go to him, it's not just micromanagement. That's a problem already in and of itself, but it's taking away the rightful authority of the colonies to govern themselves. And so when he does take that away, he doesn't actually address the issues that are going on in the American colonies. How can he? They're 3,000 miles away. It takes several months to get a message across. But that's just the beginning. Let's continue.
He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them, and formidable to tyrants only.
So again, in England, you had multiple states that work together under a common monarch. So, like I said in previous episodes, Scotland had their own parliament and England had its own parliament, but both were under one head of state, the monarch, the King of England. And the American colonies had their own colonial governments and legislatures, their form of parliament. And so what's happening here is that now if you take away and say that those colonies can no longer pass their own laws, but the laws will be handled by the king and the Parliament of England, well, now the American colonies have zero representation. You see, Scotland has its own parliament where the Scottish people get their own representatives in their own parliament, and England does the same in English parliament. But now the king is saying, for the Americans, no, you do not get representation in any parliament, and we will handle the laws. So that is what is being referred to there. Let's continue.
He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly, for opposing, with manly firmness, his invasions on the rights of the people.
Okay, so he has dissolved colonial governmental bodies, basically saying you're no longer allowed to gather, and requiring assemblies in inconvenient times and locations. For example, like in England, that would make it very difficult for the colonists to get their voice heard and represented. Let's continue.
He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the danger of invasion from without and convulsions within.
Okay, so basically the argument here, after the king dissolved these governmental bodies, he didn't allow, or he took a very long time to allow for people to elect representatives again. So they had zero legislative representation. Now, from a Christian perspective, I don't necessarily agree with the idea that ultimate legislative power should always be with the people, in the sense that whatever the people decide is right and just and moral and true. It is important to always recognize that God has already given us his law, and the people are to recognize that law. They can gather together to help apply that law in their particular situation and circumstances, and to enforce that law, and to judge whether or not someone has violated that law. But I do have an issue with saying that ultimate legislative power is always invested in the people, because that turns the people into God. So there's a hint of a form of secularism there. But I would say that this idea of sovereignty of the people, it does trace back through English history, although I don't think someone like King Alfred the Great would have agreed to that. Let's continue.
He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands.
So in this section here, the colonies are unhappy with the fact that the king is not allowing the colonies to manage their own territory with regard to settling new areas, the movement of people, and even allowing foreigners to become part of those colonies if they wish to be. So again, that's not the king's prerogative. That is an issue that each colony, just like each parliament, is able to handle itself.
He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices, and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance.
So now we're talking about, okay, first it was the legislative aspect of things. Now we're looking at the judicial aspect of things. Now, today, judges are independent. Their salaries cannot be reduced by Congress or by the president. And once they are appointed for life unless they are impeached. And the idea behind that stems from an old English idea that the judges should be able to judge independently the application of a law to a particular case. And they are not beholden to the king. The king cannot use pressure, financial pressure, or threats of losing their jobs in order to get them to give the outcome that he wants. And what was happening here is that, well, not only can the colonies not be allowed to have their own legislative bodies, the judges there need to be under the strict scrutiny and control of the king to ensure that they rule properly. And so that's what the king was doing, where the offices of the judges in the colonies, they were getting paid by the crown directly, and they were dependent upon him to maintain their jobs. And then lastly, the multitude of new offices. This is very similar to the administrative law, and I would say that what the colonies were pointing out here with this Declaration of Independence is happening today in our own country, where you have all these administrative agencies, these unelected bureaucrats. They inspect everything. They have regulations, fees, and fines, and permits, and all this nonsense. That is exactly what the colonies were upset about, because why? The king could do that and impose these laws and these tariffs and these taxes and these fees and these fines, and it was all done through this bureaucratic machine without any representation or even voting by the people. So, something to consider that's going on today.
He has kept among us in time of peace standing armies, without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power.
Now that's interesting. Of course, standing armies are a danger to any people's liberty, and the king is occupying the colonies with standing armies, and those armies are not answerable to any civil power. They're only answerable to the king, who of course is in England, 3,000 miles away. So let's continue.
He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution, and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation.
Yeah, again, pretended legislation. It's not coming from the colonies and their own representative bodies. It's coming from this administrative state, and it's a form of a foreign jurisdiction. That's essentially what that is.
For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment, for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states.
Yeah, so those two things are a problem. The quartering of large bodies of troops, you're required to sustain them and house them in your home, and you don't have to consent to it. And then, of course, protecting them from any punishment for violating any laws, because not only can the colonies not pass their own laws, they're not even allowed to have independent judges. So all of this is coming together to cause a big problem. Let's continue.
For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent.
So those two things, the taxes, that one's very easy. In this case, the king is raising taxes without any approval by the colonial legislatures, who were previously managing that until the king decided that we were done with that. As far as cutting off trade with all parts of the world, I mentioned in a previous episode that certain other countries were not allowed to trade with the American colonies because England was at war with them or in conflict with them. I think the Dutch were an example. And there were other aspects too where the American colonies were being forced to purchase only from certain groups like the British East India Company and things like that. So again, these are all decisions that are being made by English Parliament and the King, not by the American colonies.
For depriving us in many cases of the benefit of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries, so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies.
So the trial by jury situation, the admiralty courts were often used, and those courts did not require trial by jury. It dates back to the idea of committing a crime on the high seas, and you still needed to administer justice. It's certainly evolved since then, but the admiralty courts were being used And in those situations, the colonists were not allowed to have trial by jury. Or people were tried over in England. And again, a jury of your peers that's not from England, that should be from the American colonies. And then for abolishing the free system of English laws, again, English common law. So in a neighboring province, you're establishing a whole different set of laws. And that's why they said it's an arbitrary government, because, well, it's arbitrary in the sense that it has no foundation, it has no origin in the laws of nature and nature's God. Whereas English common law can date itself all the way back to King Alfred, when he put the laws of Moses as the beginning of his law book for the people of England. So let's continue.
For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering, fundamentally, the powers of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures, and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever.
I quoted that in a couple episodes prior, when Parliament actually said that they had the power to legislate in all cases over the colonies. English Parliament said that. So yeah, that's a violation of the Charter, breaking of the covenant that the king had established with the colonies a long, long time ago, and now is being torn to shreds.
He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people.
So they're referring to several battles that have already occurred between the colonial militias and the British Army. And so clearly you already have violence taking place against the colonies by the king and his troops. So that's certainly a problem. Let's continue.
He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun, with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation.
What's happening here is that mercenaries, namely, you've probably heard of like the Hessians, those are the ones that George Washington would attack on Christmas after crossing the Delaware. So the German Hessian mercenaries, very, very high quality troops, but obviously in it for the pay and have no care about the rights of the American colonists as Englishmen or anybody else for that matter. And so to do that against your own people, your own fellow Englishmen, is a problem. It seemed, of course, practical because it's easier just to pay somebody else to fix the problem, but that was not at all helping to bring the American colonists back to wanting to stay in this relationship with England.
He has constrained our fellow citizens, taken captive on the high seas, to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands.
So I believe this is referring to a concept of impressment. American sailors could be forced into the British Navy and have to serve for many, many years, and even have to serve against their own people, against the Americans. And so this, of course, is a violation of person's rights as an Englishman.
He has excited domestic insurrections among us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions.
Okay, so this is important. I'm going to spend a few minutes on this one. First of all, prior to the American War for Independence, both the French and the English had Native Americans on their side, okay? Different groups. Now, it's also important to note that during the American War for Independence, some American Indian tribes were against the Americans, and the British were inciting them against the Americans, but some were actually for the Americans. So I believe the Oneida and the Tuscarora tribes fought with the American colonists against the British. And as far as those in favor of the British, the Mohawk, the Shawnee, the Cherokee worked with the British against the Americans. And then there were some that I think tried to stay neutral, like the Lenape or Delaware Indians. So that statement about the Native Americans is a generalization. It does not mean that every single Native American tribe was an evil, wicked, savage tribe that wanted to, engage in indiscriminate warfare. But the tribes that were on the British side, for example, the Mohawk, were particularly more violent, and they didn't have the rules of warfare, being that they were not Christian. They didn't have any concepts of chivalry that for hundreds of years affected European troops, and particularly English troops. That doesn't mean that the English never committed war crimes or that the Europeans never committed war crimes. But the point is that, for example, the idea of scalping, that pre-existed the arrival of any Europeans to North or South America. So this was something that the Native Americans did to each other. Is scalping a proper kind of practice in warfare, or the killing of women and children? No. But that was a common thing that the Native Americans would do. It is a generalization, but it is generally true. So we have to fight against the woke secular education that we're getting today that says that the Native Americans were all peace-loving and just, down to the earth, loving nature kind of people, and the European colonists were the vicious, nasty ones that were just trying to rape, pillage, and plunder the Native Americans. That is not the case. Of course, there was sin on both sides, but predominantly it were the Native American tribes that were more violent and more vicious in their war. They didn't have the kind of rules of war to restrain themselves when war broke out. Let's continue.
In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince, whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant, is unfit to be the ruler of a free people.
And all that is true. And the colonists did send multiple letters. I read a couple of them over the past couple episodes. They sent letters to the people of England, just petitioning, hey, please, this needs to stop. This is getting out of hand here. And yeah, at this point, it is time for a national divorce.
Nor have we been wanting in attention to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts made by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here.
They've appealed to the British people themselves. Hey, do you understand how this works and the relationship between the colonies and the king there?
We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them, by the ties of our common kindred, to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. We must, therefore, acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends.
And so again, this is a generalization. In general, the British people had no sympathy, but that is not entirely true. Edmund Burke, for example, he sympathized with the American colonists and recognized the claims that they had. But in general, it was the case that the British people did not seem moved by the appeals of the Americans. And so, in this statement, they're going to treat them like they would treat anybody else. In war, if we're at war, they are our enemies. But if we are at peace, they are our friends. And that is a common way to deal with neighbors in other nations.
We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved.
So that is the declaration of divorce, and they are appealing to God. This is not the God of deism, okay? The God of deism is not interested in the affairs of the world. He does not answer prayer, and he does not judge the world. In deism, God just created the world and then walked away, and that's it. So, don't let anyone tell you that the American founders were all a bunch of deists. You don't use language like supreme judge of the world if you are a deist. This again is a reference to the one true God of the Bible.
And that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And, for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
So again, appeal to the protection of divine providence. The God of deism does not protect people. He's not interested in that kind of stuff. This reference to divine providence is, again, the one true God of the Bible. It's not Allah, it's not Krishna, it's not Buddha, okay? It's the God of the Bible. And so they're basically arguing, okay, we are divorced, we are free, independent states, we will manage our own affairs, we'll do anything that independent states can do, and we're going to defend each other as a group of united states. And that is the end of our Declaration of Independence. It takes about 10 minutes to read it. And so as you reflect on the upcoming 250th anniversary of our country, that you'll think about the Declaration, the language that was used, and the arguments that were made. Do you think that the colonists had a leg to stand on, that they had biblical grounds to divorce Great Britain? I personally think so. And even though I very much like the Declaration of Independence, I personally would have preferred to see more references to God's law and to Scripture, but it is not a secular document by any means, and it is a legal document. And lastly, they're also talking to a group of people that are all within a Christian context. So that must be kept in mind as we reflect on that. Is it a perfect document? No, it's not a perfect document. There were some things I did not agree with in it, particularly the reference to the people as essentially the ultimate legislative body. But I think it's a very good document, and I think that the American colonists had legitimate reasons to separate themselves from the British Empire. And so in this case, a national divorce was legitimate and authorized. And so I hope that you found this useful and interesting. In future episodes, I want to look at some of the preachers and pastors that influenced the War for Independence, and I also want to look at the Constitution itself. And so until then, if you have any questions or comments, you can email me at thegbgpodcast@gmail.com or go on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, find Governed by God or Eric Loophole to message me there. You can go to ericloophole.com and also send me questions that way. And so with that, until next time, take care and God